Welcome to the Podcasting Mentor Podcast, a podcast for entrepreneurs who are ready to stop hiding and start showing up on the right stages without the burnout. I'm Candace Dudley, podcast guesting strategist, and your go-to for turning interviews into your favorite marketing and networking tool. And guess what? My podcast guesting accelerator is now enrolling for summer. Yep, this is your sign to finally get off the sidelines and into the spotlight. Like my client, Kelly, who landed 8 guest spots in a single week after we worked together. She called it a no-brainer and said she'd 1000% do it again. That's the power of intentional guesting, and that's exactly what I'll help you do. Let's get brave, let's get strategic, and let's get you heard. Head to the show notes for more details on my podcast guesting accelerator. Okay, welcome back. I'm Candace, your go-to guide for all things podcasting, especially when we're talking about showing up confidently and strategically as a podcast guest. So today I want to talk about something that I see holding people back all the time, and that's choosing what to talk about on other people's podcasts. There is this pressure to be the expert, to have a polished list of things to say and, never ramble, never fumble. And that's just not realistic when we're starting out. Remember, let ourselves be a beginner. There's only one way to move from beginner to beyond, and that is to let yourself start, right? And so if you are someone that wants to start guesting on podcasts, putting yourself out there and you're like, gosh, what would I talk about? What topics can I put out there because I'm not an expert or I don't know enough or X, Y, and Z? I'm going to help you figure out realistically 3 aligned specific value-packed topics that you can connect back to your freebie, your offer, and your dream client. So if you've ever asked yourself, what do I even talk about when I guest on a podcast? This episode is for you. So let's start with what you already offer. Most important thing is your guest topics do not need to be pulled out of thin air. In fact, I really would advise against it. They should come straight from your offers. Freebies, transformations that you already provide people. Here's how I like to break it down when I'm working with my clients. We can think of 3 different parts. Do you have a free offer already? And in that, what quick win or transformation does your freebie offer? So for example, I have a getting started guide for podcast guesting. So in there, my quick win is hopefully that you would follow those tips, go post about it, share about it, and land your first podcast guesting spot and nail the talk, right? So that quick win of booking your first podcast guesting gig comes from my freebie. So I could come up with topics to speak on that would align with that. Again, your paid offer then is the next part, and your dream client offer. So maybe you have more than one paid offer. We want to avoid talking about 15, 20 different things at once, right? We want to get really specific. One podcast episode cannot have someone's attention being pulled in lots of different ways. We want to get really specific so that you come top of mind when those topics or clients come to that podcast host and ask for what you offer. They're going to think of you. They're going to refer people to you if you get specific. So what is your dream client thinking, feeling? What are they struggling with right before they're ready to work with you? So thinking about that kind of plan and mapping out free offer to paid/dream client offer, what speaking topics match with that? Maybe you already have those things set up. That's why you're in a spot where it's a really great time to think about podcast guesting as a way to get more eyes, especially aligned people. If you do this the right way, you're finding really aligned podcasts, that warm audience, and you're networking and just really doing a lot of great things within this one thing of podcast guesting. So if we go a little bit deeper, let's say you've got a free checklist on pitching yourself to podcasts. So one of your guest topics could be something like 3 things to know before you pitch yourself as a podcast guest. So you can think of your topics, your speaking topics, in episode titles. That allows a podcast host that's scrolling to read that and be like, boom, I need this on my show, or I don't have this covered yet. But getting specific in those titles can really go a long way. So let's take that a little step further. That last example be, let's say your dream client is a burned out solopreneur who feels invisible online. Maybe your topic is why podcast guesting is the best kept secret for introverted business owners. And that's a hint at a future episode that's coming up. You can see how those 2 examples set you up to naturally talk about what you offer. So if you can really nail a speaking topic that you came up with because of your offers, your freebies, things like that, this is really going to set the whole speech up to that whole interview to be about that and not a sales pitch, because no one wants to listen to that. And you don't want to get on podcasts and feel like you're doing that. It's gross. What makes these powerful is how specific they are. Broad topics like marketing tips or my story, that's very forgettable. But when you lead with a perspective, a problem, and a promise, you can create space for someone to think, yes, this is exactly what I need to hear. Okay, so you get those. Now you're going to actually plan out, part 2, what you're going to speak about. So the structure that I go by with a guesting spot is to really make it count. And there's a specific rhythm, kind of a 3-part rhythm that I like to get into, an episode flow, if you will. And that's your intro, your value, and your invite. So let's break that down. You start with an intro, and that's who are you, who you help, and how you help them. So you don't want to get your full life story in here, every pivot you've ever made, and get way off track. Keep it super simple. Highlight some parts that the host can be like, oh, I want to dive in more with that, or somebody can connect with you. So here's an example of one that I might use for myself. I'd say, hey, I'm Candace. I'm a podcasting mentor and guesting strategist, and I help service-based solopreneurs land aligned podcast interviews and show up like the expert they already are. That's it. It's like, boom, really quick. And you want the host to guide this conversation deeper, and you want the listeners to have instant clarity about your role and not be distracted by a huge, long backstory. Now, that may come up as you're talking because maybe the podcast is about pivots and taking big leaps, and you're going to get to share those pieces. But to begin with, it's helpful to be very clear about who are you, who do you help? And then that value, that middle part, that value is what is going to have you showing up and being seen as the expert, the authority, right? This is where the bulk of the episode is happening. You want to share real, actionable insights that can help the listener, but also leads them naturally towards wanting more from you. So you can think about what beliefs do they need to shift before they buy? What's one small win you could give them right now? What's the first step of your bigger process that you can share? So for example, if I'm on a podcast talking about podcast guesting, I might share the number one mistake new guests make. I might share how to post on Threads to land your first guesting spot, or maybe how to pick speaking topics that convert. So notice that I'm helping. I'm not handing over the entire process. And honestly, typically our entire process is going to be way too much information for one podcast episode. So I'm giving a quick win, or I'm giving a little bit, and I'm definitely providing value because I don't think that gatekeeping is the way to go. I do not believe in that. So sharing those pieces and knowing that you always will have more to share. And also there's going to be people that don't care if you give the whole process away or not. They still want help doing it, or they still want you to do it for them. So don't be afraid about actually providing value. There's nothing worse than listening to a whole podcast episode and waiting for the actual tangible tip that you can go and take and use and never getting to it. That's why I try on my podcast and when I get on other podcasts to really give some things that people can actually do. I think when we're listening to podcasts, that's the point. We're trying to learn something possibly, especially if you're listening to ones like this that are more on, entrepreneurial journeys and personal development and learning podcasting skills, right? That helps the listeners see you as the expert. And it also helps them think, oh, she can help me go deeper with this. So one thing you can do is kind of work into your talk is mentioning things like one of my clients, or I help my clients with X, or I see in a lot of my clients blank. You don't have to necessarily pitching your program or your offer, but you can mention that you have clients. And you can use that to start telling your examples or things like that, which it's the truth, right? So it's not this scheming, scammy thing. It's just the truth. But using that kind of verbiage can help people know that you do this for a business. And I think that's part of getting on a podcast and doing a great job guesting, is to make sure people know that you do that. And then your final part, the third part, remember, was to invite them. What I mean by that is at the end, the host is always going to ask you, where can people find you? Or what does it look like for someone to work with you? What do you have coming up? Do not skip out on this and just say, oh, you can find me anywhere online. And I have done this where I'm like, it's my name, CandaceDelly.com or at CandaceDelly on any social media. And that's fine. I do think that it goes a little bit better if you can be like, the best place to keep this conversation going is blank. And also, here's what you're going to get when you go there. So this is a time to plug that freebie. And remember, let's be specific. If you have a bunch of freebies, let's make sure that we're using one for each podcast episode. So maybe on a different podcast, you might use a different one. You don't have to use the same one every time you guest, but let's say you want to offer 3 freebies. I would not recommend that. I think that adds too many choices, and then too many choices leads people not to act. So tell people where to go to get that. Make it easy, make it specific. So if, for example, here's one. If you're ready to pitch yourself to a line podcast, grab my free checklist at candicedelly.com/pitch. And no, that's a made up one. It's the exact step-by-step process that I use with my own clients to help them land spots that turn into leads. You've just delivered value. Don't leave your listeners floating. Make sure you give them the next step. Where can they go? If they've listened to your entire episode, they are probably connecting with you. They are probably interested in what you're doing. So send them somewhere, because that is one step we forget and we can really drop the ball. If they listen to your episode and they never come and join your sort of neck of the woods, that didn't do much for you, right? You want to get them over into your world. So whether that's a freebie and it grabs their email, or they come over to your website, they come over to your mailing list, they come over to your social media. Doesn't have to be a big deal. Don't overthink it, but send them to one spot is definitely best. And then just some final thoughts, a little encouragement, right? There you have it. 3 topics, a clear guesting structure. That's your way to show up confidently, strategically, and fully in your expert energy. Remember that there's people that know more than you. Of course, they know more than me, but there are people waiting to hear exactly from you. There are people waiting for you and your take, and that will connect with you, and they won't connect with me, or they won't connect with Sally Sue, who's got 1 million followers. They're waiting for you. What you know is exactly the right amount for your people. So remember, your first draft doesn't have to be perfect. You can start with just one strong topic, get comfortable, refine it as you go. We're not going to be little judgy judgertons to ourselves. We're just going to get better, make improvements, and try. And we're going to start where we are, right? You already have everything you need to serve and show up, but maybe go get a mic if you don't have a mic, right? If this episode helped you feel more confident about guesting, or you want support crafting your signature topics, come hang out with me on Instagram at Candice Dudley, because I would love to hear what you're working on or what topics you're thinking about sharing. And if you haven't yet, go get my free podcast guesting starter guide. It is in the show notes. Boom. All right, that's it for today. If this episode gave you a little aha, or you're thinking about guesting on podcasts now, I'd love to hear about it. Screenshot the episode, tag me on Instagram at Candice Dudley, and let me know your biggest takeaways. And don't forget to come back next Tuesday for another episode.